Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dan Amouncy, aka Dr. D, and I am with the stupid astronomer Simon Tang. I want to ask a lot of questions here that our audience would ask. Like, why do we have all these different cameras? What are they for? And before I go into this, I got to tell you something. I'm proud of Simon. He got an APOD award, and that is a cool achievement because he got images of the ISS station traversing the sun during a partial solar eclipse, and there's only a few places in the United States where you could have gotten that, so hats off. So tell us, what are the differences with these cameras? Why do we have so many different ones? Because everybody's overwhelmed with it, and that's what we want to know.
Okay, so I've bought pretty much the entire range of cameras with me. Let's make a start with some of the ones that you physically see here right now. So we have the mini style cameras. They come in various different types. You've got the 120, you have the 174, the 290. Then we have the more traditional hockey puck looking ones, the big fat ones, these guys here. These come in pretty much all the different iterations of the cameras. And then you've got the big guys with the Peltier coolers on them. Mm-hmm. And then we have a couple of other bits and pieces which we're going to probably go into
accessories
in a second.
Okay.
So the big question here, like you were asking, what's the difference between all these cameras? So let's go through the physical sizes first, just to make it easy. So let's start with the mini camera.
It's tiny. It's the size of an eyepiece.
Yes,
it's like the size of a Plossel for all you visual guys out there, which are very few now.
So why did they come out with the mini camera? So a lot of the times people wanted to have a more compact camera.
People? Imagers?
Yeah, imagers. People in general.
Address them properly.
The imagers out there wanted to be able to use a smaller camera with their guide scope or with their telescope, and they wanted to have it similar to an eyepiece. So that's lightweight. Essentially why they created the mini.
So it's a very small sensor, yes?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The sensors that they use in these cameras are actually the same to their counterpart brothers, which are some of the bigger cameras. Mm-hmm. The efficiency behind the bigger ones have a slight difference between these ones here. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I'm using guide scopes, for example, as the best example, this is going to be the better solution. Is it going to be good for doing imaging? Not really. Right. That's why the bigger ones tend to be a lot better off. They have a better build behind them. They actually have like cooling fins, and it actually detracts some of the heat without actually having a Peltier cooler. Granted, you can't really do long exposures with them, but they still operate just as good.
And the idea that's to reduce the noise slightly, is that correct?
That is correct. Gotcha. We're going to probably go into that in just a moment.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea on the more traditional sizes. Now, the bigger guys is
1600.
This one, this particular one is the, what's this one? This is the 183 MC in particular. They all kind of have this shape. Now, the design behind this is, again, borrowing from the same principle as their original size cameras.
Right.
What they've done here is they've added a Peltier cooling system. In other words, what there is it has a heat sink and a fan that takes the heat away from the sensor and the rest of the circuitry.
And is it pretty effective?
Oh, it's
reality?
Incredibly effective.
Okay.
I mean, it's not as good as you would get with some of the CCD type cameras. They don't advertise its actual cooling temperature. They say ambient temperature. So if your ambient temperature in Celsius, because that's how they measure it, is 20 degrees Celsius, which is what is considered room temperature, the idea here is it can do 40 below ambient. So theoretically, I could do -20 with this.
Just out of curiosity, is it likely the sensor would frost up or something, or is that
It is possible. So, you know, just like you would do with just regular viewing, you can get doing problems. Well, the same thing can also occur with these cameras. They're not sealed in that fashion.
Okay.
So it's not like buying an SBIG camera that has a sealed argon purge chamber, for example.
Right, okay.
So they actually have desiccant tablets that are placed inside of these, and you know, every now and then you do have to replace them because they do wear out over time.
What is just a general question, if you don't mind my asking, is that I understand that all the cameras are CMOS cameras versus CCD.
That is correct.
It seems like CMOS is becoming more popular.
Well, CMOS is not necessarily a case of popularity. It's a case of how do I create a product that is going to be inexpensive and allow almost anybody to do imaging. See, the problem here is the reason why there wasn't so many images back in the day
Right.
was a lot of these cameras were kind of out of reach in terms of the price range.
They were ridiculously priced. It's amazing
you
how
can
affordable
end
they are
up
now.
spending like $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 on even the most inexpensive type of camera.
Right.
Whereas
I know.
CMOS has basically opened up the technology to the masses and created a product that is incredibly efficient and cost effective.
And it's still fairly good, I mean, right? I mean, the images I've seen online are pretty remarkable, I mean, in my opinion at
Well,
least.
interestingly, that's where each camera or each model has its own unique function. So I'm going to go into some of the camera differences and explain to you why you would pick one camera over a different one.
Right. Pixel size versus scope,
Right.
et cetera, kind of thing.
So one of the things that we want to dispel right off the bat is magnification. You don't use a specific camera to get more magnification, kind of like how you use an eyepiece. You know, you step up in the eyepiece sizes.
That's right, yeah.
Well, technically you can't do the same thing for a CCD or a CMOS camera. Yes, the size of the chip can determine the size of the field that you're seeing,
right.
but it doesn't work like an eyepiece.
Right.
Because the sensor itself is either limited by whatever it can see, not like how you would do with an eyepiece. You know how the eyepiece you would have, say, exit pupil. One could be one type, like say a Nagler versus a Plossl. You know, there are multiple differences with all these different eyepieces versus using a CCD or a CMOS camera.
Okay.
But again, each camera has its own unique function. Yes, some cameras do a little bit of both, some cameras do it all, but each camera has one particular function that it's really good at.
I'm going to be curious to get your feedback on it because we got filter wheels, we got the 5 versus a 7, we got the atmospheric dispersion corrector, and we got the guide scope. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, this is what the guide scope looks like. Now, it's a tiny little thing.
Oh yeah. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the guide scope. What do you normally get as a question when people come in about guide scopes?
People just talk about like, what focal length guide scope do I need versus the primary instrument that I'm shooting through?
So this is the interesting argument that a lot of people tend to have with guide scopes. The idea here is it's usually 1/4 the focal length of your actual imaging scope, not including any focal reducers or doublers of any description.
Okay, interesting.
So
a quarter.
Yeah, roughly 1/4. So if you have 1,000 millimeters, you kind of want to at least have 250 as a minimum. Personally, I prefer to go by the rule of 1/3 instead.
Right, I think you mentioned that at one time. I recall
Yeah, I have
that.
mentioned that before. It's generally, why do we go with 1/3? Well, the closer to the actual original focal length you get for guiding purposes, the better or the more accurate the guiding can become.
Right, the more sensitive, the more you see.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you have a high-powered scope, for example, like an S18, and you've got
Long focal
2,000
length?
millimeter focal length.
Right.
Well, if you've only got 500 millimeters to guide off of,
Right.
you've got a 1/4 error that can occur.
Right.
So
and that can cause your stars to elongate,
Exactly.
right? Okay.
So that's why some of us will opt for off-axis guiding, which, strangely enough, ZWO actually has the product for doing off-axis guiding, which is one of these little guys. It's absolutely tiny. The interesting thing here is it's actually designed with
So you put that little mini in
of
there?
their cameras in mind.
Right.
So, for example, here's one classic example of the Mini in action. Here's the problem with the big fat ones. You can see the physical footprint size is obviously a lot bigger. So, you know, when you have this
Right,
in
it does
here,
take up more real
It does
estate.
get up
Totally
in
does.
the way, and you're trying to keep a small system running here.
Right.
So,
But isn't it only as good as the size of the pickoff prism too? I mean, if you say in theory, if you had a camera with a big sensor, you probably wouldn't be.
well, here's the thing: is the bigger sensor.
This sensor looks like the same size as that pickoff,
Oh,
so
it
it
pretty
seems
much
like a
is.
good.
It will be a good
match.
match.
Right.
So, you know, now that we're going to go into that,
Okay.
each of the cameras have a certain size. You'll notice that a lot of the Mini cameras have smaller sensors. Part of the reason why they only made so many of them in that particular size is to accommodate for devices like this. You know, where your imaging circle technically is very, very limited. As you can see, the aperture on this is like about 6 millimeters. I mean,
Right, it's a
that's
small
tiny.
aperture. But it's enough to do it, right? I mean, as long as you have a star to pick off, it's working, right?
Correct.
It's serving the purpose it was intended for, right?
Correct.
So no issue with that. Now, what's the deal with this? I understand there's colored cameras versus monochrome cameras. What would be a situation where an imager would want a color versus a mono camera?
So interestingly enough,
using a filter wheel.
Using a filter, right. So interestingly enough, it depends on what it is that you're shooting and how you plan on shooting this. A lot of people who use color cameras instinctively do not buy filter wheels, which is actually an odd thing because...
Why is that?
Well, because they think to themselves, well, I'm only going to use one filter. What would be the need to have a filter wheel? I wouldn't use a red, green, and a blue filter in a color camera.
Right.
So, you know, we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. But one of the primary things that I've always mentioned to people is when you buy a color camera, there are actually 3 critical filters that you should always have.
Let me guess. O3, S2, HA.
That's if you're doing narrowband. That's if you're doing monochrome narrowband.
And he's a stupid astronomer.
So,
okay.
Here's the 3 major ones that I like to use if I was doing color. Believe it or not, the first one is a CLS.
Oh yeah.
City light
Broadband
suppression.
CLS.
Broadband CLS. And
Very
a lot of people
common.
don't consider this.
And it's effective, yes?
It is. It's incredibly effective. So a lot of people don't realize this.
What objects would you shoot with the CLS though? What type?
Oh, nebulosity.
Gotcha. Emission nebula, ladies and gentlemen. In case you wonder what that is, that means a red in color.
Exactly. So, but this is the thing. People tend to ignore CLS or even UHC filters on one-shot color because they don't think like they're using a DSLR camera any longer. Therefore, it has no real function. But in reality, it actually has a lot of function. And
that's important. That's a good thing to know.
Right.
That's good bit of information. You should pay heed. Okay, go ahead.
So now the next filter that I always like to have in my arsenal for color imaging is a luminance filter. Now, when I say luminance, I am being very specific. A UV IR cut specifically. That means I'm blocking out UV light and infrared, or essentially what is near infrared.
Now, is this for deep sky imaging you're referring to?
Even for deep sky imaging for one-shot color.
Okay.
And the reason why I want to do that in some cases is certain objects will react differently. So I'll give you a prime example. If you were to shoot the Horsehead Nebula and you were just shooting without any filters, you can have multiple problems occurring such as micro-lensing, strange reflections, and as you mentioned, the stars can get bloated because the UV portion of the light comes through incredibly strong.
Right.
So I can control the stars by using something very simple like a UV IR filter.
And that would help cut some of the bloating?
Oh, it cuts a lot of the bloating down.
Oh, that's interesting. That's good for people
to know. The last filter that most people do not consider, but this is very limited to 1.25" only, is an ND filter.
Aha, okay.
So
ND filter.
Why an ND filter in your filter wheel collection? Well, prime example would be the moon.
Okay.
Okay, it's always incredibly bright.
It is.
It tends to get oversaturated very, very quickly.
Yes.
And each one of these cameras have a well depth. The thing is, though, with the moon, that well depth can overflow very, very quickly and create blooming.
Oh,
That's why you tend to get halos on those stars.
But can't you cut the exposures down?
You can, but then certain other areas tend to be underexposed. Oh. So you get a very harsh contrast in the look between the two of them.
Oh, that's why sometimes you see the rays on the moon look so gray on some.
That's actually blooming.
Blooming. I'll be darned.
Yeah, that's
but I like it. It looks good. You see the rays
like it,
out.
you know, and some people don't, and it just depends on how you want to set this up. Okay. So those are actually the 3 critical filters. Admittedly, you can only get ND filter in 1.25". Okay. More often than not, they tend to also be variable ND filter, which actually do not fit in these filter wheels.
Polarizer, you mean?
Even a polarizer. There's 2 types. There's a variable polarizer and variable ND.
Oh, there is?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Polarizing filters are a different thing to ND. ND filters are equivalent to coming down 1 field stop, depending on how many stops the ND filter is.
I see.
Polarizing is used for different things. In fact, polarizing specifically is actually used for anti-reflection purposes. If you want to try this at home and you have a polarizing filter and you don't want to see our ugly faces, hold it up, turn it, and suddenly we just go
Your
black.
ugly face. Speak for yourself.
There we go. So those are the 3 major filters for color. Now, here's an interesting thing that you probably didn't realize.
Yeah.
When you're using a monochrome, would you consider using a light suppression filter, a CLS, or even a UHC if you were doing monochrome.
Would have thought no, but I'm wrong, right?
But exactly. Interestingly enough.
Why are you the stupid astronomer?
I don't know, because I do the stupid thing so you don't have to. There you go. So,
all right, go ahead.
Oddly enough, a lot of people don't actually use CLS or even UHC filters for doing luminance shots in monochrome. Remember, light pollution is still a problem. Light pollution still exists.
Right.
If you have no filter in the way blocking it. If I'm doing a luminance, it's just basically letting anything in, including the light pollution. So I can limit that by using a CLS filter on a mono chip. Yes, it's broadband, and I'm cutting out a lot of the sodium mercury vapor and some of the newer style of light pollution known as LED lighting, but I can limit a lot of that stuff down. Companies like Astrophotography sells some of the best CLS filters money can buy, to be honest.
Really? Okay.
And then there are other alternatives by other companies like Barda and Astronomics. Yeah, you know, there's plenty of companies out there to choose from. But we digress. Let's move on to the next parts.
Wow, color versus mountain. Okay,
I got it. So now here's another interesting thing.
What is this?
This is not just another piece of metal. This is actually a T2 tilter.
Okay, what would be the reason to want to tilt it?
Well, here's the thing. What's the number one problem that you have when you're using a Barlow on an imaging sensor?
I don't know.
Newton rings. Now,
yeah.
Newton rings is a phenomenon known when two flat surfaces are looking at the same thing. And what happens here is it can create this circular banding pattern.
I've seen those in refractors.
Exactly. Now, the only way to get rid of that is if the actual camera is tilted slightly.
Tilted. But once you get weird, funky, elongated stars on one side,
well, that's the thing. You have to actually just manipulate
very carefully.
Very, very carefully.
Wow.
Now, interestingly enough, some of these cameras, for example, the 1600 has an interesting setup behind it where the actual center is actually slightly offset on purpose. So if you were to shoot, you will notice that your center field is actually slightly off on purpose.
Oh, really? And that's only with the 1600?
With the 1600 in particular.
In particular, okay.
I mean, other cameras like the 071 actually have the tilter built into it, so they're actually dead centered for their sensors. But the reason why the 1600 actually has a slight shift to it is to accommodate when you're actually using a tilter.
I'll be done.
So if you had a problem with Newton rings, and if you're doing something like a bright object like the moon, or even solar like the sun, for example, without having a tilter, you cannot do the offset to get rid of the rings. And if you were to offset it the wrong way, well, then you're basically going off the field of view and you're looking at the edge of the scope, and then you get vignetting and coma and God knows what else.
So how would you know if you were going to actually need to use this? So you decide that after, or you look, you image, and you're like, oh, I think I need it?
Generally speaking, anytime you use something that is a doubler or a reducer, you should have the tilter. It's very uncommon to use a tilter if you do a reducer because the rings are harder to see. They still exist.
I'll be darned. Okay, that's really
So it's a huge misconception that a lot of people think that Newton rings cannot happen in general, but only with Barlows. It can also happen on field flatteners. It can even happen on focal reducers. It's the same principle.
What are the, that's very interesting. What's the deal with these?
So how many times have you bought a camera and you wish you could put your camera lens on a ZWO camera such as this?
Okay,
so
gotcha.
what this essentially does is they have two versions of these that are relatively popular, is one for Canon and one for Nikon. They do have a Sony adapter version of it, but it's not as popular as the Canon and Nikon ones.
Very solo.
But these ones are essentially designed for manual lenses. In other words, you can control your own f-stop and then do your own focusing and things like that without all the electronic gizmos. You can use the more modern lenses. You just have to remember to preset the aperture before you actually dismantle the camera and take the lens off and mount it on here. Really? So this basically adapts and allows me to attach my Canon 50mm or my 24-70 lens directly to the camera and use that as the telescope essentially.
Where's this threading onto?
So this threads on directly to the camera. So you'll notice that there is a ring and then
Right.
these will actually just connect straight onto this one.
Once you
This
unscrew.
particular one is, well, this particular one that I'm holding is actually made for the M54 thread.
Gotcha.
If you have cameras with a larger size.
We have a T-thread type too,
Right, there's also the T-thread type, which
probably
is
this
right
one.
that way.
Aha.
So-
T-thread model.
Same thing, T-threaded. Now you're probably going to notice that the sizes are completely different.
Image circle's big, small on this one. Here I have.
Right,
But it's good enough for the 1600.
Oh, it's good enough for the 1600. So now
Yeah.
you'll notice that the height of these
Yes.
have actually been predetermined.
So they get the distance right? So the
Correct.
stars look proper. And
So this actually
That is
is
cool.
designed to already have worked out what my back focus distance is, so I don't
Very
have
cool.
to calculate it. The ring that comes on here is an 11 millimeter T2 to T2 ring, and then the rest of it is made up from here, which is approximately 16.5 millimeters, and whatever the other back focus distance of the camera to the sensor, which in this case is actually 6.5.
that is cool.
So ZWO have gone out of their way and already calculated, good catch,
That was
calculated the
good.
back focus to all of this.
Something that a lot of people go crazy trying to figure out.
Right,
I can
that
tell
is
you
correct.
That much, so you don't have to worry about it. What is the deal now with ZWO? I know we'll get to this thing in a second.
Right.
But question: what is the deal with this?
Well, if I was to attach my camera lens to this particular camera,
Yes.
how on earth would I attach it to my telescope or to my mount or anything else for that matter? That's why they created these rings to actually clamp onto this.
I was kind of hoping they'd fit my Takahashis, but fine.
Well, it might do. I think they have a bigger one of these ones, so who knows?
That's
But
what
the
that's
idea
for. Okay.
here is so you can clamp onto the camera and then you can actually mount it somewhere. Now, interestingly enough, they actually opted for a dual design. It either takes the quarter 20 threading or what they refer to as the Argus Swiss style plate.
Argo Swiss.
Yep, for most of the popular tripods out there. In fact, any tripod out there today is using the Argus Swiss
Now it's making more
style.
sense. I see. Okay, now we're on to this. The atmospheric dispersion corrector. What is the deal with this, and why would somebody want something like this?
Well, actually, the best person to answer this would actually probably be you, because you actually do a lot of visual
I'm the
astronomy.
stupid astronomer.
Yeah, now you're going to be the stupid astronomer today.
Actually, you could go on cloudynights.com. It does. It corrects color on the limbs of the planets, and it's quite effective. You can use it photographically and visually. But
Correct.
I thought it was kind of cool to see the effects of it with images that you can go online and Google it and see pictures and shot with it. It's pretty remarkable. And you get atmospheric dispersion typically when you get lower, you get atmospheric
Right.
dispersion, but I've
So-
seen it higher.
Basically, the principle behind how this works is there are actually two pieces of glass in here that allow certain parts of the wavelength of the light to come in and also be redirected. So if you look at a camera lens, for example, most telescopes tend to come in doublets or triplets.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are a couple of singlets out there, which, this is an example of a singlet. But what a camera lens has is a couple of extra elements that actually correct for the red and blue shift. I don't mean red-blue shift in terms of wavelengths from space and distance travel. I'm talking about the light physically is shifted to one side.
Right.
Now, what the ADC allows the user to do is correct for that shift by simply moving this tilter, and the actual piece of glass in the inside actually rocks backwards and forwards.
That's right.
And then basically realigns that light to come back in. And it's actually quite intuitive.
I think it's pretty effective. You have to level it, of course.
Yes,
That's what
you
it
do
is.
have to
You
level
always
it.
have to have it in a certain angle.
And that's correct, at a certain
Perfectly
angle.
level.
So you have to spend the time to actually make sure everything's level. Once it's actually level, we set it at the default marker, which is the halfway point. I don't know if you can see it here, but we'll show you a close-up of it in just a moment. You can actually see how there's two markers here
Yeah.
that tell you its absolute limit.
Hold the
This-
markers to the audience.
This is actually set at its most extreme. Now this is where it's the middle point. And the idea here is to move it until you can actually see what's going on the actual image.
I think the best
And
thing
it
to do
will
is
shift.
fiddle with it.
Well, you can fiddle with yours all you want. Now, obviously, this all works both visually and from an imaging
Photographically.
standpoint. A lot of the times...
And usually it's for planets, right?
Yes, predominantly you use this for planets, but you can use this for nebula. It's not unheard of.
Right.
It is a little
But not as common, of course.
correct. It is a little strange.
Yeah.
But what you can do is you can see the effects more dramatically if you point this at something like the moon
Sure.
and you do the
Limbs.
shift.
Of
And you'll
course.
see a blue circle of the moon like move out to one side or then shift back in, depending on where you're moving this
Adjusting
particular dial. So that's what this is essentially for. It basically limits the fact that you have to do any kind of post-processing to move the two color channels back. Now, I will say this has no functionality if you're doing monochrome.
Right, because you wouldn't see the color anyway, right?
Exactly. So this is mainly for color imaging, either with CCD or CMOS. More CMOS than it is with color, to be totally honest.
What is more popular, in your opinion, now? People would ask, like, you know, because a lot of people that ask me questions say debate about going with color versus monochrome. Is mono more common these days because of light pollution and the adaptability to narrowband sensitivity?
Here's what I've discovered. Most people don't actually shoot monochrome to begin with.
It's so beautiful and artistic
popular,
looking, though.
Well, it is, but I mean, more popular is color because of the ease of use. That's why we refer to it as being one-shot color, because I don't have to do the red, green, and the blue.
God, but monochrome is so artistic. It takes me back to the Palomar days.
Well,
I'm living in the past, ladies and
So
gentlemen.
let's go into narrowband.
Yeah.
If you looking at a monochrome camera, and this is your first time that you're buying a camera in general, I generally don't like to recommend people shoot monochrome right off the bat, because narrowband specifically can be very, very difficult.
Really?
Because you have to actually do things like guiding.
But what about just shooting monochrome, period, for starts, to get acquainted with the imaging?
Well, even if you are just starting off with monochrome, people want that instant result.
Yeah.
And that's why, for most people who, like myself, I can be very impatient. That's why most of the times when I shoot subs, they don't tend to be longer than 15 minutes.
Really?
Just purely because I want to see something right off the bat. And I still have that inclining just to see something right off the bat. Now, one of the things that, mono does better than one-shot color is the sensitivity behind them is actually 4 times better than, say, a colored camera. And the reason why I say that is with the color camera, they have something called the Bayer matrix. What that is essentially about is one pixel is made up of a group of 4 subpixels, red, green, green, blue. Now with the monochrome camera, it has the same 4 sets of subpixels, but they now no longer register any specific color. They're either on or off, essentially, for all the pixels.
And therefore more sensitive?
So it makes it 4 times more sensitive than what the color camera can record. However, there's issues in that, like trade-offs and things like that. But again, we'll come back to that in just one moment.
Wow, it's huge. I'm curious. People are probably curious. What do you use personally yourself?
What do I use personally? I actually use a mixture of different cameras. So it all depends on what it is that I'm shooting. And it also depends on which scope that I'm using.
You do a lot of solar imaging.
So yes.
So recommend for solar.
Here's the thing about solar. It's about aperture. In other words, the bigger the telescope, the better it gets.
More resolve.
But it's not even just the bigger the telescope. The actual camera, the pixels, the bigger they are, the better it produces an image. But there's another problem with that trade-off.
What is it?
The bigger that pixel, the bigger that sensor becomes, the slower the camera gets. So there's actually only one camera out there that is, from a consumer standpoint, that people like myself and maybe even you can only afford some of the lesser things in life, I guess, is the 174. But as a imaging camera, it's actually one of the best ones. I mean, it's not cheap by any comparison, but it's actually the camera for solar specifically. Reason why? Large pixel size, but more importantly, high frame rate. And the problem is,
how many frames are you typically shooting when you use solar?
When I'm doing solar, approximately 60 frames per second.
Gotcha.
Because I'm doing uncompressed 16-bit mono, and the file sizes can be quite horrifically big. On average, 2,000 frames is going to chew up around about 4 to 5 gigabytes worth of hard drive space. So you can imagine if you shot more than so many minutes worth of the sun, you fill up a hard drive in no time. That is the drawback to this particular camera. The file sizes just tend to be horrifically big, but that's the trade-off that I'm getting on this particular situation.
Is it compatible with most of the solar scopes we see today?
It is compatible with every single solar scope.
Gotcha.
It doesn't matter what the aperture size is. It works with all of them.
Nice. That's good to know.
Some people use the 178 because they want to try and get the full disc.
Right.
Whereas the 174, the sensor is a lot smaller, resulting in less of the sun. It looks like you've got a narrower field of view versus the 178, which just has a wider field of view.
Explain to the people, because they ask this sometimes. So the smaller that the sensor is, the bigger the image will appear?
That is correct, which is kind of a partial illusion. So what's happening here is your scope has an imaging circle, and they will refer to as what part of the sensor is illuminated. Well, if you can imagine a piece of paper, and I've got a flashlight and I'm shining out the piece of paper, as its default size, we'll call it 8.5 by 11, it's going to receive all the light. Well, now if I fold that piece of paper in half, obviously the piece of paper has now gone half the size, and it only sees so much of that light all of a sudden, but that light is still coming out at it. So instead of seeing this part of the image, I'm now only seeing this part. And if I fold it again, I'm only seeing this part, and so forth down. Here's the thing, we haven't increased our magnification, we're just limiting the area of view within the imaging circle. So it gives you the illusion that I'm seeing deeper or longer focal length, when in reality the focal length never changed. What happened here is the field of view changed. Kind of like how you get an eyepiece. I can get a 25mm eyepiece, but I can get it in 82, I can get it in 90, or 92, 100 degree, and even 110 degree field of view. So it's the same principle. The magnification didn't change, but my field of view did.
What telescopes now, people want to know this when they decide. Do you have any opinions on what's more common these days as far as astrographs, like either refractor or SCT? And it sounds like to me like a lot of these cameras are compatible with refractors. It seems like refractors have made a big impact.
So
on the
refractors have probably made a huge impact in the astroimaging world. Because they're becoming more affordable, just like the CCD technology.
And very well color corrected.
Has come towards CMOS and has become more affordable. Generally speaking, CMOS cameras work better with refractors than they do with SCTs.
Interesting.
Because they're bigger cousins on these cameras. Like, for example, this particular camera is actually not so dissimilar to the camera that I'm using to film this particular video with.
Really?
This is, in this particular case, this is the 183. It's actually used in a lot of high-end production cameras, specifically.
Oh, really?
4K.
Same sensor.
Same sensors.
Interesting.
So even something like the 1600 is actually made by Panasonic, which is actually the same as the GH5 and the GH4 cameras, for example. And then you get a bunch of other cameras like the 071, which is essentially a Nikon camera, and so forth up.
I find just that we get general questions at the store where people are like, if I mention a refractor, they're like, what? They come in with the idea of buying a big SCT and a light bucket, but I think a lot of that they don't realize is predicated on what they're actually trying to shoot. Maybe, a galaxy or a planetary nebula, it's knowing that.
So let's get into some of the guts behind this. Now, like I mentioned slightly earlier, a lot of these cameras have a unique function. Well, there's only one part of this that we really need to pay attention to is pixel size. Every camera has a very specific pixel size. That number can range from anything from 1 micron all the way up to 5 or 6 microns in the CMOS realm. CCDs can actually climb as high as 12 microns in size, depending on the application. There are other sensors that have very more industrial usage. If you're doing infrared, for example, those sensor sizes, just the pixel size, can be tremendously big, and the pictures you get is just one big block. You're like, well, that's not much of a picture, but I'm only detecting heat from a long distance away, so I need as much of a sensor as possible in this particular situation.
That's one of the questions people have. Imagine it.
So here's the thing. There is a general rule of thumb based upon the pixel size. Now, let's just say I'm doing planetary specifically. And I don't mean planetary nebulas. I'm talking planets like Jupiter, Mars,
Saturn,
and things like that.
It's
very, very simple. All you actually have to do is look at the camera's pixel size. So what we'll do is we take that number
Okay.
and multiply it by 5. So
5 microns times 5, 25.
is 25, okay? What that does is it actually tells you your ideal focal ratio that you need to be at.
Oh.
So if I have an SCT that is f10, regardless of what the actual focal length is,
Right.
if I was to use a camera with a pixel size of 5, times that by 5 gives me 25. If I can get this f10 scope to f25, it'll be at its optimal focal length and focal ratio, yielding some of the best pictures you've probably ever taken, you know, seeing conditions permitting, of course.
Wow. Okay.
So, prime example, I have an Explorer Scientific 127. I use the ZWO 174mm and I shot pictures of Jupiter, Mars during the summer months when all the planets were up. And what I did specifically was I used a Barlow in order to get to that particular focal length.
Ah.
Now, sometimes you're going to get funky numbers, like in my particular case, it was f32. It's very difficult to get a scope to get to f32.
Do you use a conventional Barlow? Or?
Well, I'm using a PowerMate specifically.
Gotcha.
You know, the difference between a PowerMate and a Barlow, you know, it's been done to death. Essentially, it's telecentric versus Barlow.
Got it.
They're the same thing, but as a Barlow, the further away you are, the higher the magnification. Telecentrics tends to stay the same no matter what the distance apart is.
Right.
There is a
Didn't
tiny
change
bit of
much.
magnification.
I know, but it was not very much.
But, you know, there is a huge argument, but that's not, you know, we're not going to be
Yeah.
talking about that. I'm sure you can
Right.
find all of that information online anyway. So I use specifically a
Yeah.
4X PowerMate on a 127 at f7.5, and it actually got me close enough to that f32 number in order to yield those results.
Interesting.
Most people will turn around and say, well, that shouldn't be possible with a refractor, but that's where the mathematics behind this works out. So now, if I wasn't doing planets, what would be the better way to go for? More often than not, the bigger the pixel, the bigger the scope gets. The
I
smaller
see.
the scope,
Right.
the smaller the pixel that you want to try and go to. Now, a lot of the times you're going to hear about these bizarre calculations, you know, arc seconds, arc minutes, and arc this, that, and the other, and pixel size, and how much you're going to see.
Right.
Well, I always tell people, don't worry about things like that.
Because those terms, oversampling, undersampling.
Undersampling and things like that, they tend to kind of go above somebody's head and don't really make sense. I mean, and the long and short of it here is, the idea here is to actually take an image, so use what you've got.
Right.
In my particular case, you know, I've had, you know, multiple different cameras.
Yeah.
And I have found that in some cases when you become more advanced, yes, oversampling, undersampling does become a problem. But until you get to that point, just use the camera and start shooting.
Just start shooting. I know that was your motto. Is that just put the darn camera, start
And
shooting,
just
and find
start
out what the
taking a
mistake.
picture.
I know people have all these preconceived notions, and
But
I think
in
that
general, the
it's never
smaller the pixel size, the smaller the scope.
the scope.
The bigger the
typically.
pixel
Right,
size, the
generally.
bigger the scope. You know,
Right.
that is the normal general rule of thumb. But like I said, the only time it's not applicable is when you're doing planets. You've got to use that that little magical formula, which is whatever the pixel size multiplied by 5 gives you your focal ratio. So you can do one of two things. Either you can get your scope to that focal ratio, or you can pick the camera to the focal ratio of what you currently have. And again, you can do that with using Barlows, telecentric Barlows like the PowerMate, or even focal reducers in some situations.
What do you find yourself typically using a camera for deep sky?
I actually like to use the 1600 personally. It's what I refer to as the lazy man's camera. And
Right.
the reason why I say that is every one of these CMOS cameras, you have to do calibration frames, which, you know, in my mind, it's a lot of work for a lot of nothing, especially if I've shot a lot of light frames and I have to try and get the managing dark frames to be roughly the same length. So if I'm shooting 5 minutes or 10-minute exposures, I have to have, you know, a bunch of dark frames at that length of time as well. And to be honest, do I really want to spend 2 hours taking pictures?
I
of the
remember
back
you
of
were
my lens
talking
cap?
about that. What about flats? Do you mess around
So-
with that stuff?
Well, here's the interesting thing. With the 1600, amp glow doesn't tend to be a problem if you keep your exposures below 10 minutes. It does show up.
What does it look like? Does it illuminate the whole sensor, or is it
amp
part of
glow-
it?
amp
What is
glow
that?
is actually like,
I've heard the
as
term.
it sounds,
Right.
there is an area that has this unexplainable glow. Now,
Right.
on one particular camera, like the 183 specifically, amp glow is actually quite severe. In fact, it actually manifests itself as like a really bright star that sits in the side of the camera
Really?
and shoots out across the image. And it can be quite discouraging.
So you would think it was a diffraction from a
Right,
star.
you would think it's a
field coming in.
diffraction. You would
and
think
it's not as
it's
amp
not.
glow?
That's actually amp glow.
That's insane.
And what ends up happening there here is the heat from the actual camera and the camera's sensor is causing a false reading on the actual sensor. And what happens here is it starts to think that there's a signal there. And so it starts to build up. And then when it fills up, it overflows. But all of this can actually be corrected.
How?
So that's where the calibrated dark frames come involved. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take a dark frame and I'm going to basically average the images together, and you're going to end up with this black image with a huge diffraction spike on it, for lack of a better description.
Right.
And what it does is that particular image gets subtracted.
So you isolate the
yes.
spike,
So you
right?
actually subtract it out of your frame. So if you think of it this way, if the area of your affected image has a number between 1 and 500, for argument's sake,
Right.
well, your dark calibration frame has that particular diffraction spike almost with a value to it, say 200. But my actual light frame has a value of 300. What it's going to do is take that 200, minus it out of the 300 to give you the number of 100, which is actually the signal of what we originally had.
Wow. Now,
And it's able to bring it all back, so to speak.
people want to know what what program are you using? Is that SharpCap? I understand you use SharpCap.
Yes.
For that. What do you use to run these cameras?
So one of my biggest MOs about doing all of this astronomy stuff is I try to make it easy, idiot-proof, and just simple.
He does, but I still don't understand it.
So what I like to use is any of the products that is widely available out there and is free. One specific one is SharpCap.
It's very popular.
It is very popular. It actually comes with all the ZWO products.
How do you
strangely
like
enough.
it? What's your opinion?
Actually, I think it's one of the best free products out there.
Where's
There is
nice?
a paid version. The paid version has a little more functionality behind it. One of the biggest features being polar alignment. It essentially makes the Polemaster redundant.
Really?
Yeah, because it works in the exact
same
way, but utilizing
The
equipment.
camera that's on board.
Correct,
Instead
that
of a
you're
separate
using.
Polemaster. Well, how come nobody talks about that?
Well, I just did, didn't I?
Oh. We're not going to sell any
I'll
more
never-
Polemasters.
Polemasters,
You just gave away
exactly.
our secrets, the sales
Oops.
secrets.
So that's one of the things that I use
cool.
now. In terms of processing,
What do you use for
I
that?
like using Deep Sky Stacker. Again, it's a free software. It has its ups and downs, but it is just rudimentary. Stacks all the images, doesn't do anything fancy. Of course, it can handle light frames, dark frames, calibration, bias frames, and all that kind of stuff. But I like to do the rest of the finishing. Like getting the color saturation and things like that. I do all of that in Photoshop. Admittedly, Photoshop is not exactly free, but if you're going to throw money into this, there are other programs like PixInsight, Nebulosity, Prism, things like that. There's quite a few programs out there. I just like to use Photoshop because I've been using it since, version 2, which is what, 20-something years ago now.
Really?
Well, it's been that long I've been
That's
using
crazy.
Photoshop for.
Well, don't fix what ain't broke. A question people have a lot, and I'll ask for them. You get the people that come in with a budget. They're like $1,500, maybe a couple of grand. They want to, get their feet wet with astro imaging. What do you recommend for somebody that's kind of starting out? Simple. What would be your opinion, a selection of camera for them?
If your budget includes the telescope and the mount, I like to tell people the 178. The reason why I say the 178 is it's basically
The mono or color?
mono or the color version. Personally, I would suggest doing the color version of the 178 if it's a first-time camera. In my hands is the 183. The 178 is actually the baby brother of this, essentially. I mean, this is like the older stepchild sister that kind of just came out of nowhere. But it's essentially the 178 tiled 4 times.
Gotcha.
In fact, it is the 178 4 times.
To
create the 183.
Right,
So the reason
fair.
why I like the 178 is because it has a relatively good size and gives you a pretty good field of view, and it works incredibly well with smaller focal length scopes. especially if you've got like an 80 millimeter, a 72, or even a 65, and even smaller than that.
You know, I can't help but say this because, you know, he's talking about a small imaging astrograph. What people don't realize about deep sky objects, there's a lot of objects in the night sky that are larger than the full moon.
Right.
And once people grasp that concept, you're like, wow, I can utilize this little wide field scope, right?
I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but if Andromeda was the same brightness of the moon, it would actually take up 4 moon lengths quite easily.
Yeah, that's incredible.
You know, there's some really clever Photoshop pictures out there that show the moon with Andromeda. I mean, technically it can't really be possible to have the moon come up where Andromeda is because, you know, something's gone horribly wrong as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, they show how big Andromeda actually is in comparison to the moon, and it's roughly 4 moon widths.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And then if you look at things like the Orion Nebula,
Elephant Trunk,
you know, and all of that stuff, it's all bigger than the moon.
Yeah, it's incredible. That's the concept
We're
people have a
talking
hard time.
relatively size-wise. Obviously, they're all bigger than the moon, but
Of course.
you know, from our perspective.
From our perspective. Question that a lot of people want to know is a lot of customers, existing customers have DSLR cameras already. What's the deal as far as transitioning from a DSLR to a camera like a ZWO? Is it worth doing it? What are the differences? You know, because people ask that question. Should I use this or a DSLR camera?
Well, interesting you asked that because it's a funny transition that if I already own a DSLR camera, the actual other part of the question would be, should I buy a one-shot color? The simple answer is yes. Transitioning from a DSLR to any CMOS CCD camera like the ZWO cameras, you should still look into doing the color and the monochrome.
Why is that?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The astronomy cameras are designed specifically to do one function, astronomy. In fact, they actually have a lot of the filters that are on a DSLR removed so they become more sensitive to certain wavelengths. Most commonly, DSLR cameras are not sensitive to the hydrogen alpha band or near infrared as we refer to it. In fact, they actually do everything they can to block that.
Right.
Because it makes everything have a reddish color to it.
Right.
In some cases, if you're doing something specialist like a full spectrum camera, you get other very weird and interesting results. But from an astronomy standpoint, it's actually more desirable because we want to capture as much as possible.
What is your opinion if some imagers have the infrared blocking filters removed, for example, on a DSLR?
Well, even though they have the sensors modified, it still is not as sensitive as some of the CMOS cameras. In fact, a lot of the cameras that ZWO uses, or should I say the sensors, are actually industrial applications. Microscopy, for example, and spectroscopy. A lot of these cameras are geared to see the entire visible spectrum, whereas a DSLR camera, like I said, cuts off near infrared and further down the line UV.
I've always kind of thought, you know, one of the weird things when these guys take these infrared blocking filters out of their DSLRs, you almost eliminate all the reflection nebula, which is kind of a bummer. I've seen that where it looks subdued, you know, the reflection. And reflection's like, even though you don't get as much, it's still, if you cut that out, it's a beautiful part of the spectrum that's getting thrown out of there.
Interestingly enough, reflection nebulas tend to be a lot harder to shoot than emission nebulas, because emission nebulas tend to be exactly that. They emit in one particular wavelength or bandpass, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we do the Orion Nebula, it emits in strong hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3 with hints of sulfur 2. Now, uncommon is hydrogen beta. In fact, hydrogen beta shows up incredibly well with something like the Orion Nebula. A lot of people misconstrued hydrogen beta being closer to the red. It's actually closer to blue than anything else. And what ends up happening here is the Running Man Nebula in hydrogen beta really comes out incredibly well.
Do you have an opinion as far as, because I know you've had a lot of experiences with it, if a person's starting out and they can afford a filter, do you have a preference? I mean, I know in color you mentioned CLS.
Yep.
But if you were to go to monochrome and they could afford one filter that's common?
That's the thing. So ZWO has kits that they create, they actually give you the filter wheel and a set of narrowband filters. Most commonly, people would like to use hydrogen alpha because that gives you the best results, or at least from your perspective, it gives you the best results.
And there's situations where you do combine those other wavelengths, like S2 and O3.
So that is in reference to what is known as the Hubble palette. So you take the 3 color channels and you combine them together to give you what essentially is a false colored image. Most commonly, people would refer to something like the Orion Nebula has that fantastic pinkish reddish look with the bluish hues coming from the oxygen 3. Incidentally, if you were to shoot one shot color, that's essentially what you see. The Orion Nebula is actually one of the brightest nebulas that we can see in our galaxy. I mean, there could be another one on the other side of the galaxy. We would never know, but you know that's the one that we observe the most.
Right.
But going back to the reflection nebulas, why do DSLR cameras work so much better? Well, it's not. It's actually because we're not using the cameras in the correct fashion. The thing is, with narrowbands, I'm only looking at one specific wavelength. Now, I can do emission nebulas incredibly well with a monochrome camera, but instead of using narrowband filters, I'm going to switch to broadband. So the CLS, would it work? Well, yes, it is a broadband filter, but it wouldn't work in this case. What would work would be the red, green, blue, and luminance filters in order to shoot emission nebula. Now, the big problem with the monochrome cameras, because of its sensitivity, and I'm limiting the band, you do have to shoot and expose for a lot longer. Whereas a DSLR can generally pick these things up because they have a setting which is strictly ISO versus gain. Now, just to dispel the two differences, ISO is actually a measurement of the sensitivity of film because ISO was a number generated back in the day of film. DSLR cameras kind of copy that result.
Right.
Whereas gain is actually a measurement of noise or sound in certain cases, kind of like what you're hearing me is I have a negative decibel because I'm not screaming at you. If I crank this up, then I'll go into a positive sound because I'm shouting. Volume's really loud. So essentially with cameras, it's the same principle.
Yes.
I'm using mathematics in order to amplify the signal. So I'm increasing the gain, not the sensitivity, as you would do with a DSLR style camera. Even though DSLR style cameras, you know, they refer to it as ISO, it is actually just gain. They just call it something else.
Right.
Reality is the same thing, just two different numbers.
Yes. So the next question I had to ask you is, what is the deal with the ASI Air? I mean, it looks like a little USB hub. It's got, what the heck is this thing? What is it for? Why would anybody want this?
What the ASI Air is basically like a remote control for your ZWO camera.
Okay.
It allows you to be on the field and you don't have to bring a laptop with you in order to control the camera. So it has everything built into it, right down to guiding, the image acquisition, and you can store all the pictures directly onto the memory card that's on here. I will point out, do not wipe these cards. There actually has the software on them. So if you wipe it, then your ASI Air won't work. Luckily, you can download it again from ZWO's website in case anything happens. You know, they're not going to leave you hanging.
And I understand it's compatible with Windows and Apple?
That is correct. It is both Mac and PC compatible, as it says.
That is very cool.
And it works with any type of tablet device. Yes, it does work with your laptop if you do decide to bring a laptop.
Comes with some cables and whatnot.
Oh, it comes with all the cabling. It even comes with the adapter, so you can actually read the pictures off of this. It's interestingly enough, it even has an Ethernet socket on there. So if you actually have more of a permanent setup, like an observatory, you can use something as cool as this, and it's incredibly lightweight. I mean,
it is.
One of the things here is, you know, I don't want to add pounds.
Let me see.
And pounds
It doesn't
of
pose
weight.
any weight on this thing.
Yeah, I don't want to add pounds and pounds of weight to my existing setup, and if I'm using something like this with a small setup, it just weighs nothing.
That's cool. I want our audience to see what's on there.
And of course, it comes with the 4 USB sockets. It's compatible with most of the popular mounts out there with direct control. It's kind of a version of ASCOM, essentially.
What's the deal with this fruit or vegetable?
Well, that is the raspberry. It's actually built off of the Raspberry Pi, which is actually a low voltage computer, essentially. So
I see.
that's why they're able to operate these things for such a long
Raspberry
amount
Pi.
of time.
Okay.
I wouldn't eat it if I were you.
What pie do they have in England?
Apple.
No, they got something else. It's truffle pie with the...
Oh, I don't know. We digress.
I got another question a lot of people want to know. What is the deal with image circle? You know, there's this, you know, compatibility like SET image circle versus the image circle on a refractor and all this nonsense about, oh my God, I have aberrations on the periphery. And well, I don't know. People obsess over this stuff.
I mean, it is a bit of an obsessive point. That's why ZWO essentially came up with all different camera sensor sizes. They start from the largest, which is the full frame, which is the 128, and they work their way down to the sub-micro 4/3 essentially. Some are so incredibly small because, you know, the sensor is tiny and so are the pixels. But what they've essentially done is they've made it so you can match the camera up with your telescope. Now, ideally, if you do not have a large imaging circle, you do not want to install a camera with a massive chip, because then you're going to have all sorts of interesting problems, from vignetting right down to coma in some cases.
Really?
So a common mistake that a lot of people may do is they get a focal reducer and they don't take into the account that the imaging circle may be changed.
Oh.
Because the way that a focal reducer works is it basically bends the light path in order to widen up that image, giving you a false apparent field of view. It's the opposite of a Barlow, essentially.
Yeah.
So if you have a large sensor, say like a full frame, and you put a focal reducer on there, you're most likely going to come across vignetting, because the actual camera cannot the actual sensor is not fully illuminated by the reducer itself. Of
course.
Even though it's a smaller or a
Can't
wider
cheat it.
field of view. Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I remember something you said. Just start shooting, but you crop sometimes. Is it big deal cropping? I mean,
No. In fact, it's actually not uncommon
make such
for a lot of these things to be cropped. In fact, all ZWO cameras by default actually have predetermined resolutions that if you know that your imaging circle is only so much and you're using one of the full frame cameras, for example, you can actually pre-crop everything to get rid of all of these problematic areas.
Things already.
So you can actually create, like, say, a mosaic, and you know instinctively, okay, I may have a pixel size or a resolution, should I say, of X amount. I'm going to pre-crop this so I can see what I'm going to get without actually having to go into an image processing software later to crop the whole thing.
It seems like people go through this whole academic exercise of, you know, it's got to be pinpointed to the very corner. You know,
well, I mean, that's down to your optical path. I mean, you know, obviously you would lend yourself better in that case because you do a lot of visual side of things, so you know what the limitations are.
I think the problem is people don't. That's another subject. Don't get me started.
Well, I mean, the principle is still the same. If you have a telescope with a secondary that is very, very small, but you use a 100-degree field of view eyepiece, the problem here is that 100-degree field may see off of the edge of that secondary into nothing.
Yeah.
So you would get the same problem with the sensor. So again, the moral of the story essentially is you really have to match the sensor size to the telescope. In some cases, some people may turn around and say, yeah, but I want this size pixel, but they'd only do it in this particular camera. Well, maybe that particular camera may not be suitable for you then. You know, so there has to be some type of trade-offs.
I was thinking too, you know, something we don't mention is I often show people the astronomy tools, CCD, field of view calculator thing. You can look at that on Astronomy Tools website, and they have a CCD calculator on there, and you can put your sensor size, focal length of your scope, you can add a reducer, you can add a Barlow, and you can actually frame subjects. They have different ones you can see.
Right, and a lot of the software out there today actually has
Stellarium?
All of those built in. Yes, I mean, you can predetermine it, and it will show you your field of view.
Yeah, Stellarium's a free download. I don't personally use Stellarium, but tons of people do because it's free. I use Sky Safari, which has some of those features too.
Correct. I mean, if you have the advanced version of Sky Safari or Sky Portal, in Celestron's case, they're the same thing. Yeah. It has the field of view calculator, but again, don't misconstrued having a smaller or a larger sensor as being higher or lower magnification. Again, it's not the same.
Right, I remember you were saying that. Very cool, Simon. Well, we appreciate you sharing all this information. Is there anything we left out that we need to cover?
Yes, we have left out one important thing. If you want to know any more, give us a call. The number is 888-427-8766. You could always email us. You can check out all the ZWO products on our website on...
Telescopes.net?
Yes, that is it.
Now,
Telescopes.net.
if you have any technical questions,
Don't
details, do not ask for Dr. D. Ask for Simon. I get these calls, you know what bothers me, and you better include this in the video. Whenever somebody calls and says, can I speak to Simon? I'm afraid to say no because the next question is going to be, well, I'm having a technical difficulty with, I'm like, dude, I do not have 2 hours to have a conversation and explain this stuff. You're going to have to talk to the stupid astronomer.
That's it. That's indeed, that is
Discipline
me.
your darn customers and keep them on my back. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just ranting here. I'm just venting frustration. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching us. Visit our website at telescopes.net. I am Dr. D, your host, and this is...
I am Simon. I am the stupid astronomer because I do the stupid thing so you don't have to.
Take care.